Complications of a loss is a life.
Well, and we also have another call-in guest that knows this feeling all too well, and we want to welcome on the phone with us Ron Kelly. Welcome to Grief Chat with Mitch Carmody.
Our Ron Kelly, my buddy.
Yes, good morning, both of you. Thank you for having me on. I am honored.
I'm so excited to have you on. We're talking, we know what we're talking about today, this high-profile, ambiguous loss. And you work with so many people. You've written 3 books. You focus on men's grief, the difference between gender issues and how they grieve. And so I've heard you speak in so many places. So I'm so glad you came today to help shed some light on a very tough subject.
Oh, again, it's my pleasure to be here. It goes beyond pleasure. To be sitting here with you today is just a wonderful thing. And I heard the first part of it. What an amazing story in so many ways.
Well, tell us about your son, Ron.
Well, I am the father of Jonathan Taylor Kelly. He was a 16-and-a-half-year-old child who was just a miracle in my life. He wasn't supposed to make it beyond his first day of living. The doctors handed him to us and said he might not make it through the night because of a rare heart condition, and he lived 16-and-a-half years. He went through a number of surgical procedures where an amazing man rebuilt his heart. He wasn't supposed to pass away. It wasn't something that we expected to happen. It was a simple little medical procedure he went into the hospital with at 16-and-a-half, and unfortunately his heart, as frail as it was, gave out during recovery. An amazing child that served so many others while he was alive. The medical research they did on him, what it did for other children with the same condition that were born after him, could not ever be, it can't be calculated, it can't be tabulated. We just know that it was.
Because actually he was born with like half a heart. Am I correct? Is that
He was.
simplifying it?
The name of the condition is hypoplastic left heart syndrome. It's rare, but I think you'll understand when I say it's not rare enough. We want it even more rare. And for those times it does come out, we want it to be something they can resolve. And they've done some just phenomenal things as far as cardiovascular work on the hearts now. So I've got a feeling that other parents might not have to go through what I went through.
Right. And you weren't prepared for his death. I mean, I don't think we ever can, but yet it was thrown in your face that he could die, almost from birth, correct?
True. I mean, there was, and I talk about this quite a bit. I mean, it's much like you go through with palliative care. I mean, you know that it could be possible. He was, look at him from the outside, he was a normal child. You couldn't tell that, he had a scar across his chest, that they had basically gone into him many times over his life and done at least 5 open heart surgeries as part of this reconstructive procedure. But, he always came out of his surgeries. He recovered well. He was, back on the playground, back in school, back in doing what every normal little boy does. And it kind of goes out of your mind after a while that there is some underlying conditions there until the next surgery comes up. And like with palliative care, you always think that there's always going to be that chance that nothing bad is ever going to happen. That whatever underlying condition would never dare take him. And it does, and you have to come face to face with that. In this case, a weak and frail heart actually overcame him.
Oh, gosh, and we are very, very sorry for your loss, Ron. Ron, I know that you have done research and written about the differences between men and women and how they grieve differently. Can you tell us about that, please?
Sure. One of the things that really sprung me into this is I just did not understand my own propensity. And I know we've talked about, in this case, we were talking about ambiguous grief. I mean, I kind of refer to mine a bit as repressed grief, which really slingshotted me into where I am now. I made a conscious and a subconscious effort to hold back the grief of my child. And that it wasn't possible because 6 months into that, the spirit of John came to me in the shower and said, basically, how dare you? You will grieve me. And that was the title of my first book. Sometimes I cry in the shower because from that point forward, I decided to grieve, but I was curious. I wanted to know why. And curious is such a small word when it comes to that. Let's just say I was passionate to understand me. And there were just so many aha moments in my research where I became almost just an addict at discovering myself and why I do what I do. And I had gone for many, many years as sort of a proposal writer in the defense industry. And I thought to myself, if I can write documents that make millions of dollars for other people, I bet I could write to help other people. And if John's lot in life was to go out and help others with the same heart condition he had, then if he wants me to grieve, I shall do it in service of him. And I'll go forth and join some wonderful, wonderful people out there that are just compassionate souls that want to help others.
In repressed grief, what's the definition to you?
To me, it is. I have some underlying things in my background, and a half-hour show is certainly not going to be time to get into that. But I've lost both my mother and father, and I was very close. I come from a very close family, and I know I'll simplify it. I didn't see Mom as much as I could have. I was always able to. I just didn't. And when Mom passed suddenly, for me to grieve my mother, I also had to approach the guilt of not being there for her. So for me not to feel the guilt, and please, I am oversimplifying this, but for me not to feel the guilt, I had to not grieve. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
So, several years later in 2011, I lost my father, unfortunately, to cancer. A whole different ballgame where you actually do get to watch a loved one just deplete in everything that you knew that man was and become almost nothing when he finally passed away. But, that repressed grief with my mom worked so well with my dad, too. It was amazing how I was able to just keep the grief held inside and say, I've got people that depend on me, I've got people that rely on me, I've got a family back home, and you just repress the grief. It is a conscious and subconscious effort to not grieve. And believe me, it's more subconscious than it is conscious.
Is this like you're compartmentalizing? I can never say that word, but you put that. I know how to grieve here. This way I grieve for my mom, I'll grieve for my dad. It worked before, it'll work again. Not necessarily it's the best, but it worked, right?
Right, and I tried that with John. And between he and the big maker upstairs, they went, well, that's not going to work. And it took me about 6 months before I realized that, whether I talk about the spirit of John, whether I talk about the push from the man upstairs, I think it really all comes down to the unconditional love that I had for my son. Mm-hmm. And it was just too overwhelming for me not to recognize, memorialize, and honor his life, to not grieve him. Mm-hmm. And that was a big part of repressed grief that I had to get over. And once I realized I was holding it down inside, and that was a much bigger reason why I wanted to know why. How dare I repress that inside? What makes me the type of human that would do something like that?
Yes, and knowing when doing your research that it's not healthy either.
Not at all.
And if we want to stay healthy to keep your son alive in this world with the things that we do and what you're doing, then we need to be healthy to be able to be as loud and proud as we can be as dads. Don't you agree?
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. I wish I did not have to go through what I have been through to know what I know now. I know that's such a simplified way of saying it. I would have loved to have been this person before that loss.
But when you said slingshot, I love that, because you said a slingshot, you defined yourself. That Latin phrase, noscete ipsum, to know thyself. I mean, it happened to me, too. I didn't give a rip what people thought of me anymore. I became myself. It really gives you a risk to take emotional risks that you've never taken before, I found.
Oh, outstanding. Absolutely. The first book, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, was exactly that. If I could retitle it, I think I would retitle it Standing Naked in the Rain. if you just think about that for a moment.
Yes. It's all about being vulnerable. That's what all my workshops now, I really am focusing on the power of vulnerability. Brene Brown talks the power of vulnerability, how to be naked out in the rain, to be vulnerable to it, to be vulnerable to the pain, but vulnerable to the joy that it's our birthright. Yeah,
and one of the things I want to present to is the fact that men do live. I mean, we have a more propense tendency to live with our egos. And when we do that, we're afraid to put ourselves out there. We're afraid to put the vulnerable part of us out there. And one of the amazing things that, if there is anything, and there are some amazing things to take away from loss of a loved one, but one of the amazing things is the fact that, we have been through the fire. What worse can you do to me if I put myself out there and I show you my vulnerabilities?
Yep, that's the most vulnerable person on the battlefield is the hero.
Yes. And well said. That's a good line. Do you mind if I steal that?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, I stole it from Joseph Campbell.
Oh, Ron, tell us about. I know that's just one of your books. Sometimes I Cry in the Shower. What are your other books, please, and what did they focus on?
Well, I've got one that I'm real proud on. It's called The Grief Case. And it's actually a procedure that I went through, and I think helps out many. And I've had some wonderful, wonderful reviews of it. Where if you think about our process of grief, I say that when we lose that one that we lost, somebody handed us a grief case, and it's normally given to us by somebody we don't know. but it is that object that you are going to carry around with you for the rest of your life. You can't leave it anywhere. You can't put it behind. But if you think about it, we hear this word, and we'll say this word 1,000 times in the next 2 days, but grief. I hear it all the time. What about Timmy's grief? What about Sally's grief? What about Becky's grief? And I stop people and I say, I want you to realize grief is just a word. Grief is a word that holds and contains all the emotions that are inside of bereavement. It holds the fear and the anger and all those upsetting, just highly emotional charges that we have inside. So if I were to ask you how you feel immediately after your loss, you're not going to say, I feel grief. You're going to say, I feel hurt. I feel sad. I feel lonely. So grief is not really the word that we're looking for. It is actually the holder or the container or the case that holds the emotions inside of grief. So as I thought about that, I thought, well, how do we carry that around with us, and how do I get people to visualize that? And I thought of the grief case. And then I thought of the manila folders that you normally find inside of a briefcase. The manila folders in the grief case are all labeled with your emotions. And when you first get it, and again, it's given to you by somebody you don't know normally, those files are jumbled and they're overstuffed, and there's redundancy, and there's false guilt and false anger and lots of bad things in there. And as you take the time to open up the grief case and process through those files, they'll become lighter and lighter. And as they become lighter and lighter, that grief case, which never leaves you, is going to become easier to carry around. It's not going to be as burdensome anymore. And it's not going to trip you up and knock you over, because we all know we are just socially out of it after our loss. There's nothing that we can accomplish. Our minds are gone. Everything is gone. That is the heft and the weight of the grief case when you first get it.
And Ron, how did you discover that men and women grieve differently?
Well,
I mean, what was the most telling
I say
thing?
this with a little bit of jest, but it is the truth. In studying men, you also have to study women. I say when you study the light, you have to study the dark, so you'll forgive me for that. But in order for us to set aside why we are different from women, of course, we have to go back and take a look at why women are the way they are, too. And this whole thing, I tell people, whether you believe we came from the Garden of Eden or whether you believe we crawled from the primordial ooze, it really goes back to the dawn of time. It goes back to nature. And it comes forward to nurture. The oldest debated topic in psychologic field is nature versus nurture real? And it truly is. We get a lot of that from nature. And in studying why men are the way we are, from the long hunting trips to hiding in the bushes and repressing our fear because the animal that we hunt is probably going to eat us if we do it wrong, to looking at the women and the empathy they require to be around the children and care for a child that can't even speak, let you realize it's almost obvious that so much of who we are came from nature. And then as we come forward, I studied the nurturing of boys, where Dad said big boys don't cry, and the nurturing of women as they grew, and how they were trained by mothers to be empathetic. It became a natural thing to realize that we are two diametrically, mentally opposed genders, but we're that way for a reason. We're that way because we actually complement each other.
Yes, and I think we're seeing that's why we do see a lot of PTSD, I think, in males and alpha males, because of that. I think the cavemen had PTSD because they were guarding the cave all the time, always on hyper-vigilant alert. But yet when they were done with it, they sat down and let it go. But we stick with it in our high-moving society. We tend to just carry that through. Well,
we want to say thank you. Ron, thanks for calling in today. Our guest, Ron Kelly. One of the books he has written, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower. Wonderful conversation about repressed grief. And we remember your son, Jonathan Taylor Kelly, today on this show, Grief Chat. And we want to say thank you for tuning in. You are listening to Grief Chat with your host, Mitch Carmody, on AM 1460 and FM 97.7 KDWA in Hastings.
Smile, though your heart is aching. Smile, even though it's breaking. When there are clouds in the sky, you'll get by if you smile through your